Here's what nobody tells you about bad South Park episodes. They're not bad the way bad television is usually bad. They're not lazy. They're not phoned in. Most of them are the result of two guys, Trey Parker and Matt Stone, pushing so hard against the walls of what a 22-minute animated comedy can do that sometimes they just break through into nothing. They swing so hard, they miss. And the miss is fascinating, because when South Park fails, it fails in ways that tell you more about the show than half its greatest hits ever could. I've been thinking about this a lot. We spend all this time talking about the best South Park episodes. Scott Tenorman Must Die, Make Love, Not Warcraft, Casa Bonita, and those conversations are great, don't get me wrong. But I think you learn more about a show by studying where it stumbles. You learn what makes the engine work by finding the moments where it stalls. And South Park has stalled in some truly spectacular ways over its nearly 3 decades on the air. So tonight, that's what we're doing. We're going through the worst of the worst. The episodes that fans skip on rewatches. The ones that Trey Parker and Matt Stone themselves have openly said they hate. The ones that sit at the bottom of every IMDb ranking, every fan poll, every episodes you can skip list. And here's what I'm going to argue. Stay with me on this. I think every single one of these bad episodes is secretly teaching you something important about why South Park works when it works. Every failure is a lesson in disguise. The bad episodes are the show's shadow self, and if you understand the shadow, you understand the whole thing. If you're watching this late at night, get comfortable. We're going to be here a while, and if you haven't subscribed yet, it really does help us keep making these for you. Hit that button. It matters more than you'd think. Okay. Let's start with the episode that even Trey Parker says everyone hates, including him. Pip, Season 4, Episode 14. It aired on November 29th, 2000, the day after Thanksgiving, if you can believe that. Comedy Central ran it the Wednesday after the holiday, and I have to imagine at least some families who'd gathered around the TV expecting their usual South Park experience got something profoundly, bewilderingly different. Because Pip isn't really a South Park episode, not in any meaningful sense. It's a retelling of Charles Dickens's Great Expectations, starring the show's most forgettable recurring character, narrated in live action by Malcolm McDowell, yes, Alex from A Clockwork Orange, doing a masterpiece theater bit. And none of the main boys appear. Not Stan, not Kyle, not Cartman, not Kenny, none of them. Now look, I understand the ambition here. Parker and Stone wanted to do something completely different. They'd learned a hard lesson from Terrence and Phillip in Not Without My Anus, the Season 2 premiere that aired on April 1st, 1998, as an elaborate April Fool's prank when fans were desperate to learn who Cartman's father was. That episode generated over 2,000 angry emails to Comedy Central within a week. 2,000. In 1998, when sending an angry email actually required effort. So when Parker and Stone decided to make another episode without the main boys, they at least had the sense to hire Malcolm McDowell to appear at the top and essentially warn viewers, this is going to be a very different experience. Don't say we didn't tell you. And honestly, the first 5 minutes of Pip are kind of charming. The Dickensian setting is rendered in that flat construction paper style, but with these grotesquely detailed adult character designs that look nothing like anything else in the show. Estella's face has this weird, sharp-nosed quality that makes her look like she belongs in a completely different animated universe. Miss Havisham is this crumbling, monstrous figure. The art direction team clearly had a blast designing this world. You can feel the animators enjoying themselves. But here's the problem. Pip is, and I say this with genuine affection for the character, one of the least interesting characters South Park has ever created. He's a nice British kid. That's it. That's his whole deal. He's nice. He's British. He gets bullied. He has no edge, no depth, no contradictions. And when you build an entire 22 minutes around him, with no Cartman to bounce off of, no Stan to ground things, no Kyle to get righteously indignant, you're left with a character who can't carry the weight. Parker himself put it bluntly in an interview with Entertainment Weekly. Everyone, including us, hates Pip. Matt Stone was slightly kinder. He said, I don't hate it, but it was like, why did you guys do that? And that question, why did you guys do that, is actually the key to understanding what makes Pip instructive. Because the answer is that Parker and Stone were experimenting with format. They were testing whether South Park could be an anthology show, whether it could step completely outside its own universe and tell a different kind of story. They were asking, what is South Park without South Park? And the answer they got was, not much actually. The show's strength isn't just its satire or its crudeness, or its topical speed. It's the characters. It's the four boys and the insane town around them. Remove them, and you're just doing a mediocre Dickens parody with robot monkeys and a Genesis device. Here's a production detail most people don't know. Pip was a banked episode, one of the first in the show's history. South Park famously operates on a 6-day production cycle, cranking out each episode from script to air in less than a week. But sometimes, Parker and Stone try to get an episode partially done ahead of time so they can take a few days off during a production run. Pip was that episode for the second half of season 4. They'd finished Helen Keller, the musical, which aired on November 22nd, 2000, then went home for Thanksgiving, came back on Sunday, and finished Pip in time for its Wednesday airing. It was the path of least resistance, an episode set in a completely different world that didn't need to connect to any ongoing storylines. I actually think about Pip a lot when I watch the show's later experiments, because South Park did eventually learn how to step outside its comfort zone without losing its identity. The Imagination Land trilogy, the Console Wars saga, the streaming specials. They found ways to go big and ambitious while keeping the core cast front and center. Pip was the failure that taught them how to succeed at that. And the character of Pip himself was eventually killed off in the season 14 episode 201, crushed by the Mecha Streisand, as if the show was finally putting a period on that particular experiment. But I want to sit with something for a moment. There's this tendency among fans to treat the worst episodes as embarrassments, things to be forgotten, and I get that. But Malcolm McDowell's performance in Pip is genuinely funny. When he says, "And they all lived happily ever after, except for Pocket, who died of hepatitis B." That's a great joke. The problem isn't that the episode has no merit. The problem is that it has no anchor. It's a balloon without a string. Pretty to look at, impossible to hold on to. Alright, so Pip taught us that South Park needs its core characters. But what about when the show removes the boys and replaces them with a towel? A Million Little Fibers, Season 10, Episode 5, April 19th, 2006. And I'm going to defend this episode for about 30 seconds before I tear it apart, because I think the setup is actually kind of brilliant. The James Frey memoir scandal was one of the great media stories of the mid-2000s. This guy wrote A Million Little Pieces, which was supposed to be this searing, brutally honest memoir about addiction and recovery, and Oprah Winfrey put it in her book club and made it a massive bestseller. Then, The Smoking Gun revealed in early 2006 that huge chunks of the book were fabricated. Frey had made up arrests, invented interactions with police, fabricated details about family tragedies. And Oprah, who had initially defended him, brought him back on her show on January 26th, 2006, and absolutely eviscerated him on national television. That's gold for South Park. That's exactly the kind of cultural moment that the show was built to satirize. And they do satirize it through Towelie, the pot-smoking talking towel, who writes his own fabricated memoir called A Million Little Fibers, and ends up on the Oprah Winfrey Show. As a concept, it works. Towelie is already a character who exists in a perpetual state of denial about what he is. He's a towel, but he doesn't want to be a towel. So having him write a fake memoir where he pretends to be a person is genuinely clever. The problem is the B-plot, and here's where I need you to just trust me that I'm describing this accurately. The B-plot involves Oprah Winfrey's vagina and anus, named Minge and Gary, respectively, becoming sentient, having conversations with each other, calling journalist Geraldo Rivera on the phone, and eventually taking Oprah hostage at gunpoint. Yes, Oprah's vagina holds her at gunpoint. Look, South Park has done gross-out humor brilliantly. The show has made me laugh at things I'm not proud of laughing at, but the Minge and Gary subplot just doesn't land. It's not shocking enough to be transgressive, and it's not clever enough to be funny. It's stuck in this weird middle zone where you're watching sentient body parts negotiate a hostage situation, and you're just confused, not offended, not amused, confused. And in South Park, confusion is worse than offense. The show can survive being offensive. It can't survive being confusing. IGN's Eric Goldman gave the episode a 3 out of 10, one of the lowest scores any South Park episode has ever received from a major outlet. And here's the thing that makes me feel like this verdict was deserved. Even Parker and Stone agree. Parker told Entertainment Weekly, "That did not turn out well. I had higher hopes for that. If we were going to have Oprah's butthole and vagina and the gun and everything, it should have been in a show with the boys, not the towel. And Stone's assessment was even more devastating. Weird on top of weird with weird in the middle. I'd erase that one. Weird on top of weird with weird in the middle. That's actually a perfect diagnosis of why this episode fails. South Park's weirdness usually works because it's grounded in something real. Cartman's insanity is grounded in the mundane reality of elementary school. Randy's escalating madness is grounded in the recognizable desperation of suburban fatherhood. The satire hits because you recognize the world being satirized. But when you stack Towley's memoir fraud on top of sentient genitalia, on top of a hostage crisis, nothing is grounding anything. Every element is equally absurd. There's no straight man. There's no tether to reality. And this is the second lesson the bad episodes teach us. South Park needs a reality anchor. The crazier the premise, the more grounded the surrounding world needs to be. When Cartman starts a crack baby basketball league in season 15, it works because Stan and Kyle react with appropriate horror. When Randy becomes Lord in season 18, it works because the family's embarrassment is real. A Million Little Fibers has no one reacting normally to anything, and so nothing registers. This episode also has the unfortunate distinction of being the lowest rated South Park episode on IMDb, hovering around a 6.1 out of 10. For context, most South Park episodes sit comfortably in the 7 to 8 range, and the best ones, your Scott Tenorman Must Die, your Make Love, Not Warcraft, are up in the 9s. A 6.1 is catastrophic by the show's standards. It means that even the devoted fans who rate every episode are saying, this one just doesn't work. But you know what? A Million Little Fibers was also a bank episode, just like Pip. It was intended to be produced in advance during season 10 to give Parker and Stone time off during their production run. But unlike most banked episodes, it required more work than anticipated and practically had to be scrapped and rebuilt under time pressure. That rush shows. The episode feels like it was assembled from spare parts, two separate B-tier ideas, Frankenstein together without the connective tissue that makes South Park episodes feel unified. I keep coming back to that Matt Stone quote. I tuned in to watch South Park. I did not tune in to watch Oprah's vagina talk to her butthole and a towel. There's real wisdom in that complaint, even though it sounds ridiculous out of context. What he's saying is, you need to give the audience what they're here for. Not every single time. Not in a formulaic way. But if you're going to deviate, the deviation itself needs to be compelling enough to justify the absence of what the audience loves. A Million Little Fibers isn't compelling enough. It's just there. Okay, here's where I want to talk about an episode that sits in a really interesting space. Because it's not universally hated. In fact, a lot of fans defend it. But it appeared on multiple worst of lists. Trey Parker and Matt Stone have expressed regret about it, and the conversation around it has changed dramatically over the years. I'm talking about Mr. Garrison's Fancy New Vagina, Season 9, Episode 1, which aired on March 9th, 2005. I need to tread carefully here, because this episode deals with gender identity and transgender issues in ways that were provocative in 2005 and have become deeply uncomfortable by modern standards. The basic premise is that Mr. Garrison undergoes sex reassignment surgery and becomes Mrs. Garrison. Inspired by Garrison's confidence, Kyle decides to undergo a negroplasty to become a tall, black basketball player, and Kyle's dad, Gerald, gets surgery to become a dolphin. The episode's argument that these surgeries are equivalent is one that has aged poorly in a cultural landscape where transgender rights and identity are far better understood than they were 2 decades ago. But here's what's fascinating about this episode from a production standpoint. Parker and Stone came into season 9 with, by their own admission, basically no ideas. They had a vague concept for an episode about hippies and another about Garrison getting a sex change, and they essentially winged the rest of the season from there. Parker later said that several days before this episode's air date, he was so stressed that he nearly pulled a Dave Chappelle and gave up entirely. The original cut of the episode contained over 5 minutes of footage from a real sex reassignment surgery. Actual surgical footage, unedited, because they didn't have enough material to fill the episode without it. Comedy Central made them cut it down to a few 1-second shots. Think about that for a second. The show was in such creative dire straits at the start of season 9 that they were padding the runtime with unedited medical footage because they literally didn't know what else to put in. That's not the confident, take no prisoners South Park of Scott Tenorman Must Die. That's a show running on fumes. And yet, and this is the contradiction I want to sit with, Season 9 ended up being really strong overall. Trapped in the Closet, which aired on November 16th, 2005, the episode that took on Scientology and led to Isaac Hayes leaving the show, is one of the most culturally significant episodes South Park ever produced. The Losing Edge, their brilliant youth baseball episode, is a fan favorite. Season 9 proved that even when Parker and Stone start from nothing, they can find their way to brilliance. But the road there can be ugly. I actually think Mr. Garrison's fancy new vagina represents something important about how South Park approaches sensitive topics. The show's philosophy has always been that nothing is off limits. Everything can be satirized. And for the most part, that fearlessness is what makes the show great. But fearlessness without precision is just recklessness. And this episode is reckless. The joke that gender reassignment surgery is the same as wanting to be a different race or a different species flattens a complex human experience into a cheap, false equivalence. It mistakes being provocative for being insightful. Here's the thing nobody talks about, though. The episode introduced one of the show's most productive long-running storylines. Mrs. Garrison stuck around for multiple seasons. The character's gender journey became a recurring element that the show actually handled with increasing nuance over time. By the time Garrison transitioned back to male in Season 12's Eek a Penis, which aired on April 9th, 2008, the show had developed a more textured understanding of gender identity. And the Garrison as Trump storyline that dominated seasons 19 through 24 drew on the character's history of identity flux in ways that were genuinely clever. So here's my take. Mr. Garrison's fancy new vagina is a bad episode that planted the seeds for good ones. It's the rough draft of an idea the show would eventually figure out. And that's a pattern you see throughout South Park's worst episodes. They're often failed first attempts at concepts the show will nail later. Let me pivot to something different. I want to talk about episodes that fail, not because they're too weird or too offensive, but because they're too thin. Episodes where the premise just can't sustain 22 minutes. And the prime example of this is Jacovosaurs. Season 3, Episode 4, June 16th, 1999. God, this episode. Okay, so the boys are camping at Stark's Pond, and Cartman discovers a prehistoric creature called a Jacovosaur. It's this big, yellow, duck-like thing that stumbles around breaking stuff and making unfunny jokes. It's also extremely loud, extremely annoying, and extremely deliberate in its annoyingness, because the Jacovosaurs are a direct parody of Jar Jar Binks from Star Wars. Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, which had been released just weeks before the episode aired. And here's the fundamental problem. The episode is trying to make fun of how annoying Jar Jar Binks is by creating a character who is even more annoying. But to make you feel how annoying the Jacovosaurs are, the episode has to actually be annoying. It has to subject you to the thing it's mocking. And unlike the best South Park satire, which lets you laugh at the target from the outside, Jacovosaurs traps you inside the experience. You're not watching someone else deal with an annoying creature. You're dealing with an annoying creature for 22 minutes. It's the comedy equivalent of someone punching you in the arm and saying, "Annoying, right?" Yes, it is. Please stop. The episode was directed by Matt Stone and written by Trey Parker, Stone, and David A. Goodman. And in the audio commentary for the episode, Parker and Stone acknowledged that fans don't like it because it's annoying, but argued that this is the point. To which I say, okay, sure, but being annoying on purpose is not automatically clever. You can be aware that something is grating and still choose not to grate. Self-awareness doesn't excuse the experience. Now, I do want to give credit where it's due. There's one genuinely funny element in Jacovosaurs, and that's Cartman being the only person in town who finds the creatures funny. The visual of everyone else cringing while Cartman doubles over with laughter is a perfect illustration of Cartman's terrible taste and contrarian personality. It tells you something real about who he is. If the episode had done more with that dynamic, used the Jacovosaurs as a lens to examine what different characters find funny and why, it could have been something. Instead, it just has Jacovosaurs being annoying for the whole runtime. The episode's also interesting in terms of production context. It was made concurrently with the post-production of South Park, bigger, longer, and uncut, the show's theatrical film, which was released on June 30th, 1999, just 2 weeks after Jacovosaurs aired. Parker and Stone were essentially running two massive productions simultaneously, and you can feel the divided attention. Jacovosaurs has the energy of something that was written by people who were already mentally somewhere else, pouring their best ideas into the movie while giving the show whatever was left over. The Jacovosaurs themselves have one of the more creative etymologies in the show. The name sounds like jack-off-a-saur, a portmanteau of a crude slang term and dinosaur. It's the kind of detail that suggests the character was conceived as a joke first and a satire of Jar Jar second. And honestly, if the episode had leaned into the crudeness more, made the Jacovosaurs genuinely dangerous or disturbing rather than just annoying, it might have worked. The show has proven time and again that it can make disgusting things funny. But annoying things? That's a much harder sell. The IMDb rating for Jacovosaurs sits at about 6.4 out of 10, which is low for South Park, but not catastrophic. And interestingly, the creatures have had a minor second life in the franchise. They appear as enemies in South Park, Snow Day, the 2024 video game. So even the show's worst ideas can find a home eventually. I should talk about Terrence and Phillip in Not Without My Anus. I mentioned it earlier, but this episode deserves its own moment because it represents a specific kind of South Park failure, the deliberate provocation that backfires. Season 2, Episode 1, April 1st, 1998. Here's the setup. Season 1 had ended with a cliffhanger. Who is Cartman's father? Fans spent weeks speculating. The anticipation was enormous. This was 1998. Before social media made spoilers instantaneous. And the South Park phenomenon was at its absolute peak. Millions of viewers tuned in to the Season 2 premiere expecting answers. What they got instead was an episode about Terrence and Phillip, the Canadian comedians who exist as a show within a show on South Park, trying to save Canada from Saddam Hussein while doing lots of fart jokes. The episode opens with a narrator recapping the Cartman's father cliffhanger, then announces that the resolution will not be shown tonight, and instead presents the HBC Movie of the Week, featuring Terrence and Phillip. It was an April Fool's Day prank, and Comedy Central was flooded. Over 2,000 angry emails in a single week. Fans harbored grudges for years. Media outlets described viewers as having been duped. The Toronto Sun listed the episode as one of the most memorable television moments of 1998. Matt Stone's response to the backlash was characteristically blunt. In Entertainment Weekly, he said, "If you get that pissed off because you don't know who a little construction paper kid's father is, then there's really something wrong with you." And this is the part that kills me, he also said that Terrence and Phillip in Not Without My Anus is his and Trey's favorite episode of South Park, which I think he was being sarcastic. But with those two, you never really know. Here's what I think is important about this episode. It's not bad in the way Pip or A Million Little Fibers are bad. It's bad because it's a prank, and pranks have a shelf life. The episode aired on April 1st, and if you were watching live, there was something genuinely wild about the experience. The confusion, the anger, the slowly dawning realization that you were being trolled by the creators of a show you loved. That's an event. That's a moment in television history. But once the moment passes, what's left is just a 22-minute Terrence and Phillip episode with a lot of fart jokes and a plot about Saddam Hussein and Celine Dion and a character called Ugly Bob. And it's fine. It's just fine. The fart jokes get repetitive. The Canadian humor is one note. The Saddam subplot doesn't go anywhere interesting. The episode was written by Parker, Stone, and Trisha Nixon, and directed by Parker. It has a 6.1 on IMDb, matching A Million Little Fibers for one of the lowest in the series. And it's rarely been rerun since its original airing. Comedy Central seems to know that the joke only worked once, but the prank itself had lasting consequences. The show referenced it multiple times. In Cartoon Wars Part 2, in Terrence and Phillip Behind the Blow, in Eat, Pray, Queef. It became part of the show's mythology. This moment where Parker and Stone chose their own amusement over their audience's expectations, and somehow made it a defining creative gesture. I actually respect the hell out of it, even though the episode itself isn't very good, because it established something crucial about what South Park is. It's a show that will never be owned by its audience. It will never do what you want it to do just because you want it. And that defiance, that absolute refusal to be predictable or safe or audience-friendly, is the engine that powers every great South Park episode. The prank was a bad episode that protected the show's creative soul. But here's where I want to start complicating my own argument. Because up until now, I've been saying that every bad South Park episode teaches you something about why the show works. And I believe that. But there's a category of bad episode that I find harder to defend. And those are the episodes that fail because the satire misses its target. Not because the target was wrong, but because the execution was sloppy, poor and stupid. Season 14, Episode 8, October 6th, 2010. Cartman wants to become a NASCAR driver, but believes he needs to become poor and stupid to do so. He gives all his money to Butters, chugs tubes of Vagisil to induce memory loss, steals a race car, and wreaks havoc. Kenny, who actually loves NASCAR, spends the episode trying to stop Cartman from making the sport look bad. The concept is solid. Cartman's oblivious prejudice, being the thing that creates the reality he's prejudiced about, is a great South Park idea. And Kenny being the one who's genuinely hurt by the stereotyping is an unusually emotional angle for a character who usually dies as a punchline. But the episode doesn't go deep enough. The message, hey, NASCAR fans aren't actually stupid, is true, but there's not enough complexity to build an episode around. Cartman talks in a ridiculous accent, eats Vagisil, crashes cars, and Kenny gets mad. That's basically it. The satirical insight doesn't evolve over the course of the episode. It just gets repeated. The AV Club gave it a B-. IGN gave it a 7 out of 10. Reviewers consistently noted that the episode lacked bite, that it was, in the words of one critic, docile by South Park standards. And here's the thing, none of the real NASCAR drivers parodied in the episode, Jimmy Johnson, Tony Stewart, Danica Patrick, were offended. Danica Patrick later said on Joe Rogan's podcast in January 2018 that she felt honored to be parodied and that it was one of the first moments she felt she'd made it. When your targets aren't even mad at you, you probably haven't pushed hard enough. Funnybot is another episode in this category. Season 15, Episode 2, May 4th, 2011. Jimmy hosts the school's first annual comedy awards and declares Germany the least funny country in the world. The Germans retaliate by creating Funnybot, a robot comedian who looks like a Dalek from Doctor Who and eventually decides to destroy the world as the ultimate joke. Meanwhile, Tyler Perry won't stop showing up at the school. I remember watching this when it aired and thinking, this should be funnier. The premise is great. The idea that comedy awards shows are inherently unfunny, that comedy dies the moment you try to honor it, that the Germans would engineer a solution to their reputation problem with typical German efficiency. All of that is classic South Park. And the Dalek design for Funnybot is a genuinely inspired visual gag. But the execution is plodding. The episode spends too long on setup and not enough on the escalation. Funnybot's rise to stardom is told to us rather than shown. And the resolution, Jimmy defeats Funnybot with a logic paradox about whether accepting a comedy award is funny or not, is a Star Trek reference that lands with a thud. The episode aired just 3 days after Osama bin Laden was killed, and Parker and Stone managed to incorporate references to the event, including a near-verbatim recreation of Obama's address to the nation. The Wall Street Journal praised this as an impressive example of speedily manufactured humor. And they're right, the topicality is impressive, but topicality isn't the same as quality. Funnybot proves that South Park can be timely and still be flat. It was watched by 2.591 million viewers, but the episode sits at a 6.4 on IMDb, placing it among the show's lowest rated. You know what's funny? I've been thinking about this as I've been working on this video. The episodes that fail because the satire is too thin, Poor and Stupid, Funnybot, others I could name, are actually more common than the episodes that fail because they're too weird or too offensive. South Park's biggest risk isn't going too far. It's not going far enough. When the show holds back, when it pulls its punches, when it identifies a target but doesn't commit to destroying it completely, that's when it flounders. The best South Park episodes are ruthless. The worst are timid. Let me talk about Brittany's new look for a minute, because this is an episode that shows up on worst of lists, but that I actually think is misunderstood. Season 12, Episode 2, March 19th, 2008. Written and directed by Trey Parker. The episode follows Britney Spears as she's hounded by paparazzi, attempts suicide with a shotgun, survives with half her head missing, and is eventually photographed to death in a ritual sacrifice that the episode explicitly connects to Shirley Jackson's short story, The Lottery. Now, I understand why people put this on worst of lists. It's deeply uncomfortable. Watching a cartoon Britney Spears with half her skull blown off try to perform at the MTV Video Music Awards while the crowd heckles her is a lot. The episode is intentionally unpleasant. It wants you to feel complicit. When the boys initially try to photograph Britney for cash, and she attempts suicide out of despair, The episode is pointing its finger directly at the audience. You consume this stuff. You're part of the problem. But here's why I think this episode is actually good, even though it feels terrible. The ending, where the entire town, including Stan and Kyle's parents, participates in Brittany's death as a harvest ritual, and then immediately turns to the rising Miley Cyrus as their next target, is one of the most devastating things South Park has ever done. It's not just social commentary, it's prophecy. The episode aired in March 2008, and it predicted with eerie accuracy exactly what would happen to Miley Cyrus and a dozen other young female celebrities in the years that followed. That final shot of Stan and Kyle reluctantly joining the crowd's Latin chanting as they turn toward their next victim, that haunts me. So, Brittany's new look is on the worst of lists, but it shouldn't be. It's a case of an episode being rated low because it makes the audience uncomfortable, not because it's poorly made. And that's an important distinction. An episode that makes you squirm is doing something. An episode that makes you bored is doing nothing. I'll take discomfort over boredom every single time. If you've made it this far, you already know this isn't just a video about bad episodes. It's a video about what makes South Park work. And the thing that makes South Park work, more than the speed, more than the crudeness, more than the political fearlessness, is the balance between chaos and heart. The show is at its best when it's simultaneously outrageous and emotionally true. And the worst episodes are the ones that lose that balance. Either they're all chaos and no heart, a million little fibers, or they're all concept and no execution, funny bot, or they're all provocation and no insight, Jacovosaurs. I want to spend some time on Stanley's Cup now. Season 10, Episode 14, November 15th, 2006, the season finale. And this is an episode that polarized the fan base in a way that few South Park episodes have before or since. Here's the premise. Stan's bike gets towed, and the only way to get it back is to coach the Park County Pee Wee hockey team. The episode is a parody of the Mighty Ducks and every other underdog kids sports team movie you've ever seen. Stan is reluctantly thrust into the role of inspirational coach. The team is terrible. One of the kids, Nelson, has cancer. Everything is set up for a feel-good underdog triumph. And then, in the final act, the Pee Wee team goes up against the Detroit Red Wings. The actual, adult, professional Detroit Red Wings. And the Red Wings don't take it easy on them. They demolish these 5-year-olds. It's brutal. The kids are getting crushed, slammed into boards, destroyed on the ice. And then Nelson, the kid with cancer, dies. Not in a poignant, redemptive way. He just dies. Off screen. A quick cut to his body, with no reaction from anyone. Parker and Stone defended the ending. Parker said, "A lot of people didn't get that one. We thought the ending was really sweet and weird, but nobody really got it." Stone added, "The hockey one is like 3/4 of a show, but the ending is fucking sweet." And here's where I want to push back a little on the creators. I get what they were going for. The point is that real life doesn't follow movie formulas. Underdogs don't always win. Kids with cancer don't always get their miracle. The Detroit Red Wings aren't going to let 5-year-olds beat them just because the narrative demands it. That's a legitimate observation about the dishonesty of sports movies. But the execution is so bleak, so relentlessly grim, that the satirical point gets buried under the sheer unpleasantness of watching cartoon children get physically destroyed by adult hockey players. The middle section of the episode, a 0-0 draw against Adams County, is boring filler. Kenny and Cartman don't even appear. Kyle shows up for one scene. It's basically a Stan Solo episode without enough material to justify being a Stan Solo episode. And it was the season finale. After a season that included Make Love Not Warcraft and Trapped in the Closet and Tist, some of the show's all-time best. They closed it out with an episode where a kid with cancer dies and a Pee Wee hockey team gets annihilated. As a creative choice, I find it fascinating. As an episode of television, I find it exhausting. But, and this is the reversal I want to make here, because I've been building towards something, I actually think Stanley's Cup has gotten better with age. Hear me out. In 2006, the ending felt gratuitous, mean for the sake of being mean. But now, after years of watching South Park continue to subvert expectations and refuse easy sentiment, the episode reads differently. It reads as a mission statement. This show will never give you the ending you want just because you want it. This show respects you too much to lie to you with a fake redemptive arc. The kid with cancer doesn't make it. The underdog team gets destroyed. because that's how things actually go sometimes. And pretending otherwise is a different kind of cruelty. Dan Iverson of IGN gave the episode a 9.1 out of 10, calling the satire hilarious. That's a wildly different assessment than most fan reactions, and it suggests that the gap between Stanley's Cup as an episode of television and Stanley's Cup as an experience of viewing is enormous. If you're analyzing it, it's sharp. If you're living it, it's miserable. Great art, terrible vibes. Okay, I've been dancing around the big one, and it's time to address it. Season 20. The whole thing. The worst season of South Park, according to fan consensus, critical reception, and, I'd argue, the creators themselves, given that they titled the season finale, The End of Serialization as We Know It. Season 20 premiered on September 14th, 2016, and aired 10 episodes through December 7th. All 10 were written and directed by Trey Parker. It was the show's most ambitious experiment, a fully serialized season-long narrative, following 3 interconnected storylines. Internet trolling, with Kyle's dad Gerald revealed as the troll Skankhunt42, nostalgia, the member berries, and the 2016 presidential election, with Mr. Garrison as a stand-in for Donald Trump. The premiere episode, Member Berries, pulled the show's highest ratings since 2006, and then it went off a cliff. The problems stacked up fast. The serialized format meant that each episode had to advance 3 different storylines, while also being individually entertaining, and they couldn't consistently do both. Plot beats that should have been compressed into 2 or 3 episodes were stretched across the entire 10-episode season. The member berries, sentient fruit that feed people nostalgic memories, started as a clever metaphor for how nostalgia fuels reactionary politics and quickly became repetitive and irritating. Gerald's trolling storyline went from being a sharp commentary on online anonymity to an interminable subplot about Danish government surveillance software. And Cartman, I don't even know how to describe what happened to Cartman. Here's the thing, Cartman got a girlfriend, Heidi Turner, and the show tried to make Cartman a reformed character, sensitive, caring, supportive. He stopped being a comedic sociopath and started being a gentle boyfriend. In a vacuum, that's a bold creative choice, but in practice, it robbed the show of its most powerful comedic engine. A nice Cartman is like a car without an engine. You can sit in it, but you're not going anywhere. The season also suffered from something that South Park's rapid turnaround production model usually protects against: being overtaken by events. Parker and Stone had built their narrative around the assumption that Hillary Clinton would win the 2016 election. When she didn't, when Trump actually won, the show had to scramble. The episode that aired the night after the election, Oh Geez, featured a clearly improvised ending where the characters react to an outcome nobody on the show had planned for. And the remaining episodes felt like they were trying to land a plane that had been thrown off course by a hurricane. I think the real problem with Season 20 goes deeper than plotting or politics, though. The serialized format took away what has always been South Park's greatest strength: the reset. Most South Park episodes end with a return to the status quo. The insane events of the episode are resolved, everybody goes home, and next week you start fresh. That reset is what allows the show to be fearless. You can blow up the world on Wednesday, because you know it'll be back to normal on Wednesday. Season 20 eliminated the reset, and without it, every creative choice became permanent. If Cartman is nice in episode 3, he has to stay nice in episode 4. If Gerald is a troll in episode 1, you have to deal with Gerald being a troll for 9 more episodes. The show lost its flexibility, its spontaneity, its ability to pivot, and the response from fans was brutal. Rotten Tomatoes scores were mixed. Rotten Tomatoes critics gave it decent marks. There's a 68% critic score, but audience reaction was harsh. The season is consistently ranked dead, last, or close to it on fan season rankings. The member berries became the most hated recurring element since Jacovosaurs. And the Cartman-Heidi relationship, which would actually become genuinely interesting in season 21 when it evolved into a commentary on emotional abuse, was, in season 20, just baffling. I want to dig deeper into why the Cartman-Heidi dynamic specifically failed in season 20 and succeeded in season 21, because I think the comparison tells you everything about the difference between a bad South Park idea and a bad South Park execution. In season 20, Cartman falls in love with Heidi Turner after she deletes her social media and becomes invisible to the online world. He becomes nice, supportive, genuine. And while there's a surface-level intrigue to seeing South Park's most notorious sociopath behave like a decent human being, the show never commits to exploring why he's changed or what it costs him. The nice Cartman just exists, a flat anomaly in a show built on sharp characterization. He says girls are funny and smart. He holds Heidi's hand. He stops scheming, and the comedy evaporates, because comedy is built on friction, and nice Cartman has no friction with anything. But then season 21 happened, and Parker and Stone did something brilliant with the same relationship. They made it into a study of emotional manipulation. Cartman didn't really change. He was performing niceness, and when the performance became exhausting, his true nature reasserted itself. He started gaslighting Heidi, undermining her confidence, making her believe she was the problem. And Heidi, unable to see what was happening, started transforming, gaining weight, becoming angry, adopting Cartman's worst traits. It was one of the most devastatingly accurate portrayals of an abusive relationship I've ever seen on any show, let alone an animated comedy about 8-year-olds. The Moss Piglets episode I mentioned earlier, season 21, episode 8, November 15th, 2017, actually contains a crucial beat in this arc. Heidi, having fully become a mirror of Cartman, starts burping, being rude to other girls, and eating the tardigrades. And Cartman, seeing his own worst qualities reflected back at him in someone he supposedly loves, has a genuine moment of horror. He created this. He made her into him, and he doesn't like it. It's a moment of self-awareness that would have been impossible without the foundation laid in season 20. But that foundation, while necessary, was badly built. The good version of the Cartman-Heidi story required the bad version to exist first. Season 20 was the rough draft. Season 21 was the revision. This is maybe the most important pattern in all of South Park's worst episodes. They're frequently rough drafts, first attempts at ideas that the show will execute better later. The man-bear-pig correction I mentioned earlier is the most dramatic example, but it happens constantly on a smaller scale. The clumsy early takes on sexuality in seasons 2 and 3 gave way to the nuanced, award-worthy South Park is gay, and later the genuinely progressive treatment of Tweek and Craig's relationship in season 19. The blunt first-season satire of religion evolved into the surgical precision of Trapped in the Closet and All About Mormons. Even the show's visual language evolved. The crude paper cutouts of season 1 became the sophisticated but deliberately crude Maya animations of later seasons, each visual upgrade informed by the limitations discovered in the previous one. I think there's a philosophy at work here that goes beyond learn from your mistakes. Parker and Stone seem to genuinely believe that bad work is a necessary precondition for good work, not in a you have to fail before you can succeed, inspirational poster kind of way, but in a practical, workshop-tested kind of way. The 6-day production cycle doesn't allow for extensive pre-production. You can't workshop an idea for months before animating it. You have to put it out there, see if it works, and adjust. The audience is, in a sense, the test audience for every episode. If it works, great. If it doesn't, you know what to do differently next time. The bad episodes are the data. The good episodes are the conclusions. I realize I've been defending the bad episodes for this entire video, and I want to make sure I'm not overcorrecting. Some of these episodes are genuinely not good. A Million Little Fibers is not good. It's boring, it's disconnected, and its two storylines undermine rather than enhance each other. Pip is not good. It's well-intentioned, but fundamentally misconceived. Jacovosaurs is annoying, even by the standards of a show that's trying to be annoying. I'm not arguing that these episodes are secretly masterpieces. I'm arguing that they're secretly important. There's a difference. A masterpiece is something you admire. An important failure is something you learn from. And I've learned more from the bad South Park episodes than from most shows' best episodes. Because South Park's failures are failures of ambition, not laziness. Every bad episode exists because someone was trying to do something interesting and didn't quite pull it off. That's a fundamentally different kind of failure than a show that plays it safe and produces adequate, forgettable television. I'll take an ambitious disaster over a competent nothing every day of the week. There's something else I want to address because it's been nagging at me throughout this entire process. The idea that South Park's worst episodes are concentrated in certain eras. Because if you look at the data, the IMDb ratings, the fan rankings, the critical assessments, there are clear clusters. Seasons 3 and 4 have some clunkers, because the show was still figuring out what it was. Season 10 has A Million Little Fibers and Stanley's Cup, which feel like creative exhaustion after 5 years of relentless output. Season 20 is the serialization disaster, and the later seasons, from about 22 onward, have a handful of specials and episodes that feel like the show is coasting. Not bad exactly, but not reaching for the heights it's capable of. But between those clusters, there are extraordinary runs. Seasons 5 through 8 are, by almost any measure, the golden age of South Park. Season 9 has some of the show's most consequential episodes. Season 13 is wild and brilliant from start to finish. Even the bad eras have standout episodes. Season 20 gave us Member Berries, which, whatever you think of the season, has one of the most arresting opening sequences in the show's history. The national anthem scene, with the boys kneeling and the audience reacting, is South Park doing what it does best, capturing a cultural moment in one perfect, brutal image. The worst episodes cluster because creativity clusters. When the energy is high and the ideas are flowing, you get sustained runs of brilliance. When the energy dips, when Parker is burned out, when the political landscape is moving too fast to satirize effectively, when the format experiments aren't working, the bad episodes pile up. But the dips never last more than a season or two. The show always comes back. It always finds its footing. And I think that resilience is as much a part of South Park's identity as its best episodes are. One more thing I want to talk about before we close: the role of Trey Parker's perfectionism in creating both the best and worst episodes. There's a story Parker tells in various interviews about how he sometimes destroys scripts at 3 in the morning on production night because they're not good enough, and then has to write a new script from scratch in the few hours before the animation team arrives. Some of the show's best episodes emerged from that desperation, forced into existence by the pressure of an immovable deadline and a blank page. But some of the worst episodes also emerged from it. When the replacement script isn't better than the discarded one, when the 3 a.m. inspiration doesn't arrive, you end up with something that feels incomplete. Not bad in the way lazy work is bad. Bad in the way unfinished work is bad. Like a building with the scaffolding still up. I see this in Funnybot. I see it in Going Native. I see it in a lot of the mid-tier episodes that aren't terrible, but aren't clicking either. They feel like they were almost something. Like there's a better version of the episode hiding inside the one that aired, and Parker just didn't have the time to find it. The 6-day cycle is merciless. It demands results, regardless of whether the creative gods have delivered. And sometimes, the results are scaffolding. Parker has been open about the toll this takes on him. He's talked about anxiety, about the feeling that every episode could be the one that proves he's a fraud, about the near constant sensation of creative inadequacy that coexists with his extraordinary output. And I think that vulnerability, that willingness to acknowledge that he doesn't always know what he's doing, is what gives South Park its soul. The show feels alive because it's made by someone who's genuinely uncertain, who's genuinely struggling, who's genuinely trying, in the moment, to figure out what's funny and what matters and what he wants to say. Sometimes the figuring out happens on screen, and it's messy. That's the worst episodes. And sometimes the figuring out produces clarity, and it's transcendent. That's everything else. I want to circle back to something I said near the beginning of this video, because I think it's become clearer after everything we've discussed. I said that the worst episodes are the show's shadow self. And I meant it. Carl Jung talked about the shadow as the parts of ourselves we reject, suppress, deny. The parts we don't want to look at. And for South Park fans, the worst episodes are exactly that. The parts of the show we skip on rewatches. The ones we don't recommend to new viewers. The ones we pretend don't exist when we're telling someone why South Park is brilliant. But Jung also said that integrating the shadow, accepting those rejected parts, is essential for wholeness. And I think the same is true for South Park. The show isn't the best episodes. The show isn't the worst episodes. The show is all of them, together, in sequence, each one informing the next. The brilliant trapped in the closet exists in the same creative universe as the misguided Pip. They share a production team, a voice cast, a creative philosophy, a 6-day production schedule. They're siblings, and you understand one better by understanding the other. There's also something worth saying about the fans who defend the worst episodes, because they exist and their perspective matters. I've spent this whole video operating from the consensus, the IMDb ratings, the critical assessments, the creator's own opinions. But there are people who genuinely love Pip. People who think A Million Little Fibers is underrated. People who watch Stanley's Cup and find the ending not just sweet, but genuinely moving. And who am I to tell them they're wrong? Art isn't a math problem. It doesn't have a single correct answer. The episodes that I've called the worst might be someone's favorite, and their experience of those episodes is just as valid as mine. This is especially true for episodes that people encountered at specific moments in their lives. If you were 12 years old when Jack of a Sores aired, and it was the first South Park episode you ever saw, it might hold a place in your heart that no amount of critical analysis can dislodge. If Pip introduced you to Dickens, it might be more meaningful to you than Scott Tenorman Must Die. Context matters. Personal history matters. The worst is always subjective, always provisional, always open to revision. I think about this a lot when I make these videos. I'm presenting my perspective, informed by research, by the creator's own words, by fan consensus, by rewatching every episode multiple times. But it's still my perspective, and I want to hold it lightly. Because the moment I start treating my opinions as facts, I become exactly the kind of authority figure that South Park has spent its entire run mocking. The show is fundamentally anti-authoritarian. It doesn't trust experts. It doesn't trust consensus. It doesn't trust anybody who claims to have the definitive take on anything. And I think the show would want me to remind you, this is one guy's opinion. Watch the episodes yourself. Make your own list. Disagree with me in the comments. That's what this is for. You know, there's one last thing I want to mention before we close. Something that crystallized for me while making this video and that I can't get out of my head. South Park has been on the air for almost 30 years. That means there are fans today who are younger than the show itself. People who've grown up with South Park the way previous generations grew up with The Simpsons or Looney Tunes. And for these fans, the bad episodes aren't missteps. They're chapters. They're part of a larger story about growing up and growing old and watching something you love change and stumble and pick itself back up. I've watched South Park for most of my adult life. I've seen it be brilliant, and I've seen it be terrible, and I've seen it be everything in between. And somewhere along the way, the bad episodes stopped bothering me. Not because I stopped caring about quality, I care more than ever, but because I started seeing them as part of something bigger, a creative life, a body of work, a decades-long conversation between two artists and their audience. And in a conversation that lasts nearly 30 years, some of the things you say are going to be brilliant, and some are going to be stupid, and most are going to be somewhere in between. The important thing is that you keep talking, that you keep showing up, that you keep putting yourself out there, knowing that some of it won't land. That's what South Park does. Every week, every season, every year. It shows up. It makes something. Sometimes it's great. Sometimes it isn't. And then it does it again, and again, and again, for almost 30 years. The worst episodes aren't interruptions to that process. They're part of it. They're the heartbeats between the highlights, the breaths between the speeches, the pauses that make the music possible. Okay, I think I've said what I needed to say. And I hope after everything we've been through tonight, every bad episode, every failed experiment, every ambitious disaster, you feel the same way I do. Not disappointed in the show, not frustrated by it, but somehow, improbably, more in love with it. Because a show that can fail this spectacularly and still come back this brilliantly is a show worth loving, flaws and all. But here's the reversal I promised you at the beginning of this video. Here's where I want to flip everything I've said on its head. Every single lesson I've identified from the worst South Park episodes, every failure, every misstep, every creative dead end, they all had to happen. South Park couldn't have survived for nearly 30 years without them. The show needs its failures the way a fighter needs their losses. Pip taught them to keep the boys central. A Million Little Fibers taught them that weirdness needs grounding. Jacovosaurs taught them that being annoying on purpose is still being annoying. Terrence and Philip in Not Without My Anus taught them that pranking your audience can only work once. Stanley's Cup taught them, well, I'm not sure it taught them anything. I think they still think that ending is sweet, and maybe they're right. And Season 20? Season 20 taught them that South Park needs to be able to reset, that serialization works in small doses, two-parters, trilogies, occasional continuity callbacks, but not as a season-long straitjacket. Season 21 scaled back the serialization. Season 22 found a better balance. The Paramount Plus specials, post-COVID, the streaming wars, used the extended runtime of specials to do serialized storytelling in a contained format. Every good creative decision of the post-Season 20 era was a direct response to what went wrong during Season 20. I want to go deeper into some episodes that don't always make the official worst of lists, but that represent specific kinds of failure I find fascinating. Because the episodes we've talked about so far, Pip, A Million Little Fibers, Jacovosaurs, those are the famous bad ones. The consensus picks. But there's a whole tier of episodes below the radar that tell equally important stories about what goes wrong when South Park doesn't work. Going Native, Season 16, Episode 11, October 17th, 2012. This is a Butters and Kenny episode where Butters starts acting out at school, beating up Scott Malkinson, yelling at the other boys, telling Kyle he's sanctimonious, and Stan he's self-centered. And his parents explain that he's actually a native Hawaiian who needs to return to his homeland for a coming-of-age ceremony called a Hapa Noa. Kenny goes with him. When they get to Hawaii, the native Hawaiians turn out to be white tourists who own timeshares and use Mahalo rewards cards. A war breaks out between the natives and the Coast Guard over the rewards program being canceled. And the whole thing ends with Butters' anger being explained as jealousy toward Ben Affleck for the success of Argo. On paper, there's a lot to work with here. The satirical concept of white tourists who've convinced themselves they're indigenous is sharp. Kenny writing letters home like a soldier deployed overseas is a funny structural device. And Butters delivering a genuine reason you suck speech to each of the boys in the opening is a rare moment of the show acknowledging the unspoken dynamics between these characters. But the episode grinds to a halt once Butters reaches Hawaii, because the central joke, timeshare owners acting like indigenous warriors, is a one-note gag that can't sustain 22 minutes. Marcus Gilmer of the AV. Club gave it a B-, noting that it gets too far away from the characters at its center. IGN's Max Nicholson gave it a 6.3, calling the recurring joke not broad enough for mass appeal. The Ben Affleck punchline is the real problem though, because it's random. It comes out of nowhere. Butters' anger, which the episode has been treating as this deep, almost primal transformation, this biological calling connected to his heritage, turns out to be about a celebrity he's jealous of. And while South Park often reveals that the deep source of a problem is something trivially stupid, that's actually a recurring structural device. This particular trivial reveal doesn't connect to anything else in the episode. It doesn't illuminate Butters' character. It doesn't comment on the Hawaiian tourism satire. It's just there, a punchline that doesn't punch. According to the DVD commentary, the Hawaiian setting was chosen partly because Trey Parker owns a home there and wanted to mine his own experience of being a mainland transplant. And there's an interesting self-deprecation at work. Parker mocking his own feelings of belonging in a place where he's objectively a visitor. If the episode had gone harder in that direction, made it more explicitly about the delusion of white people who move to beautiful places and start acting like they discovered them, it could have been devastating satire. Instead, it pulls its punches. It treats the timeshare natives as broadly absurd rather than specifically cutting. And again, that pattern. South Park's worst episodes are the ones that don't commit. I keep thinking about the show's visual evolution, because I think the animation itself tells a story about South Park's relationship with failure. The very first episode, Cartman Gets an Anal Probe, which aired on August 13th, 1997, was animated with actual construction paper cutouts, physical paper, stop motion. It took months to produce. The characters were deliberately crude, roughly assembled from geometric shapes, their movements jerky and limited, and that crudeness was part of the joke. The show looked bad on purpose. It was a comedy show that wore its cheapness as a badge of honor. But over the years, as South Park transitioned to digital animation using Maya software, a process that started with the second episode and was fully implemented by season 5, something interesting happened. The animation got better. The backgrounds got more detailed. The character movements got smoother. The show could do things that were genuinely impressive. The World of Warcraft sequences, the elaborate movie parodies, the sweeping battle scenes in Imagination Land. And yet it maintained the illusion of crudeness. Every character still looks like they were cut out of construction paper. Every building still looks flat. The aesthetic is preserved, while the technique evolves behind it. This is, I think, a perfect metaphor for the show itself. South Park looks simple. It looks cheap. It looks like anyone could make it. And that illusion is one of its most powerful tools, because it makes you underestimate it. When the show hits you with a genuinely devastating satirical observation, or an unexpectedly emotional character moment, it hits harder because you weren't expecting depth from something that looks this rough. The worst episodes are the ones where the illusion breaks. Not the illusion of crudeness, the illusion of effortlessness. When an episode feels labored, when you can see the gears turning, when the jokes feel constructed rather than discovered, that's when the spell breaks. FunnyBot. feels constructed. Going native feels labored. A Million Little Fibers feels like two separate things stitched together by force. In contrast, the best episodes, even the weird ones, even the ambitious ones, feel inevitable. Scott Tenorman Must Die feels like it couldn't have happened any other way. Effortlessness is the show's most important illusion, and the bad episodes are the ones that reveal the effort. I want to spend some time on the show's relationship with controversy, because several of the worst episodes are controversial ones, and the line between a controversial episode that fails and a controversial episode that succeeds is thinner than you'd think. There's a concept in writing that Parker and Stone have talked about extensively in interviews: the but therefore rule. Every story beat should be connected to the previous one by but or therefore, never by and then. This happens, therefore this happens creates causality. This happens, and then this happens creates a list. The best South Park episodes are chains of but and therefore. Cartman discovers Scott Tenorman is scamming him. Therefore, he vows revenge. But his initial plans fail. Therefore, he needs a more elaborate scheme. But the elaborate scheme requires genuine manipulation. Therefore, he tricks the adults. And so on, each beat flowing inevitably from the last, until you arrive at the chili. The worst episodes break this chain. Jacovosaurs are discovered, and then the town finds them annoying. And then Cartman likes them, and then they go to France. That's a list, not a story. The but, therefore rule also explains why the topical episodes sometimes fall flat. When the show is responding to a news event, the story beats are often dictated by the event rather than by internal logic. The Charlottesville rally happened, and then the rednecks protest, and then Alexa replaces workers. That's a list of observations about a cultural moment, not a story that builds toward a revelation. The best topical episodes: Trapped in the Closet, Fish Sticks, Make Love, Not Warcraft, find a narrative engine within the topical subject. They turn the news into a story. The worst topical episodes simply illustrate the news, which is a different and lesser thing. I should also talk about something that comes up in fan discussions, but rarely in critical analysis: the role of rewatchability in determining which episodes are considered the worst. South Park is a show that people rewatch a lot. The dedicated fan has probably seen their favorite episodes dozens of times. And certain episodes that seem fine on first viewing reveal their weaknesses on repeat viewing. The surprise of a plot twist, the novelty of a premise, the shock of a gross-out gag. These elements work once, maybe twice, but by the 5th or 10th viewing, all that's left is the underlying craft. And if the underlying craft isn't there, the episode falls apart. This is why Pip gets worse over time. There's nothing to discover on rewatch. The Dickens parody hits once, and then it's done. Same with Terrence and Phillip in Not Without My Anus. The April Fool's prank is a one-time experience, and without it, you're just watching a mediocre Terrence and Phillip episode. By contrast, the episodes that top the best of lists: Scott Tenorman Must Die, Casa Bonita, The Death of Eric Cartman, reveal new details on every rewatch, background gags you missed, subtle foreshadowing, character moments that land differently when you know what's coming. They're dense. They reward attention. The worst episodes are thin. They offer everything on the surface and nothing underneath. There's actually a mathematical way to think about this. The IMDb ratings for South Park episodes represent averages, but they don't capture the full picture. An episode rated 7.0 might have most votes clustered tightly around 7, meaning consensus. It's a decent, if unremarkable, episode. Or it might have votes split between 10s and 4s, meaning passionate disagreement. The truly worst episodes tend to have tight clusters at the low end. The polarizing episodes, Brittany's New Look, Stanley's Cup, Royal Pudding, tend to have wide distributions. Wide distributions suggest that the episode is doing something strong enough to provoke a reaction, even if that reaction is negative in some viewers. Tight clusters at the bottom suggest that the episode isn't doing much of anything. I actually went through the IMDb data for every South Park episode while putting this video together, and the pattern is clear. The episodes with the lowest average ratings are not the most controversial ones. They're the most forgettable ones. A Million Little Fibers, Pip, Jacovosaurs, Funnybot. These aren't episodes that made people angry. They're episodes that made people shrug. And a shrug, for South Park, is the worst possible outcome. The show can survive anger. It can't survive indifference. Let me also address the question of whether South Park has gotten worse over time, because this is a common claim among longtime fans, and it connects directly to the worst episode's conversation. The argument usually goes something like, the golden age was seasons 5 through 8, maybe stretching to season 13, and everything after that has been a slow decline, punctuated by occasional flashes of brilliance. I don't fully buy this. I think what's actually happened is that the show's relationship with its audience has changed. In the early seasons, South Park was a shared cultural event. Everyone watched it. Everyone talked about it. The episodes felt bigger because the audience was bigger and more engaged. As cable viewership declined and streaming fragmented the audience, individual episodes stopped being cultural events and started being episodes. Good ones, bad ones, mediocre ones. The show didn't get worse. The context around it changed. A great South Park episode in 2024 reaches a fraction of the audience that a good South Park episode reached in 2003. That shift in cultural footprint makes the newer seasons feel smaller, even when the quality is comparable. That said, I do think the show has become more uneven. The later seasons have higher highs and lower lows than the middle seasons. An episode like Banned in China from season 23, which was literally banned in China for its criticism of Chinese government censorship, is as sharp and fearless as anything the show has ever done. But it sits in a season that also includes several episodes of Tegrity Farm's humor that feels like it's running on autopilot. The variance has increased, and with increased variance comes more entries on the worst of list. But I want to push back on the decline narrative one more time, because I think it's important. South Park in 2025 is a show that's been making itself under extreme conditions for nearly 30 years. That's over 300 episodes. That's more than 1,500 individual writing sessions, each one starting from nothing. That's 1,500 blank pages that Trey Parker had to fill. The fact that the fill rate, the percentage of those blank pages that produce something genuinely great, has remained as high as it has, is not evidence of decline. It's evidence of extraordinary sustained creativity. Most creators burn out after 5 years. Parker and Stone have maintained a creative output that would be impressive for 5 years over a span of 6 times that. The bad episodes aren't evidence that the show is declining. They're evidence that the show is human. And human things, creative things, living things, have good days and bad days. The question isn't whether South Park has bad episodes. Of course it does. The question is whether the good episodes still justify the project. And for me, the answer is an emphatic yes. As long as South Park can still produce something as sharp as Banned in China, as emotionally devastating as You're Getting Old, as structurally audacious as the post-COVID specials, the bad episodes are just weather. They pass. The show endures. I want to spend some time on the show's relationship with controversy, because several of the worst episodes are controversial ones, and the line between a controversial episode that fails and a controversial episode that succeeds is thinner than you'd think. I should also talk about the episodes that fans have retroactively reevaluated, because worst of lists aren't static. They change over time as cultural context shifts and as the show itself evolves. Man Bear Pig, Season 10, Episode 6, April 26, 2006, was originally seen as a mean-spirited dismissal of Al Gore's climate activism. Gore was portrayed as a delusional, attention-seeking former vice president chasing an imaginary creature. At the time, many fans thought the episode was punching down, mocking a public figure for caring about a genuine crisis. But then, 12 years later, South Park did something remarkable. In the season 22 two-parter Time to Get Cereal and Nobody Got Cereal, which aired on November 7th and 14th, 2018 respectively, the show brought Man Bear Pig back. Only this time, Man Bear Pig was real. Undeniably, devastatingly real. And the adults of South Park were forced to reckon with the fact that they dismissed the threat for years because they didn't want to give up their comfortable lifestyles. The show was admitting it had been wrong about climate change. It was doing something almost unheard of for a comedy series, publicly correcting its own mistake. That correction recontextualized the original Man Bear Pig episode. What was once seen as mean-spirited dismissal became the first chapter of a longer story about denial and eventual reckoning. And suddenly, the original episode wasn't just a bad take. It was the setup for one of the most self-aware acts of creative accountability in television history. Does that make the original episode good? No. Al Gore was still treated unfairly in 2006, but it makes the original episode part of something good, and that's a distinction worth making. This is something I think about a lot with South Park. The show has been running so long that its bad episodes exist in a larger context than most bad TV. A bad episode of a show that runs for 3 seasons is just a bad episode. A bad episode of a show that runs for 27 seasons might become the first chapter of a story the show hasn't told yet. Parker and Stone have the luxury of time. They can circle back, correct course, reframe old material in new light. And they do this more than most people give them credit for. I want to pick up on something I said earlier about the show needing a reality anchor, because I think there's a related concept that explains a lot of the worst episodes, and I'd call it the empathy gap. South Park's greatest strength is that, beneath all the crudeness and offense and shock value, it genuinely cares about its characters. Cartman is a monster, but the show understands why he's a monster. His absent father, his enabling mother, his desperate need for attention and control. Butters is constantly abused, but the show treats his resilience with real tenderness. Stan's nihilistic crisis in You're Getting Old, Season 15, Episode 7, June 8th, 2011, was one of the most emotionally honest things any animated comedy has ever done. The worst episodes are the ones where that empathy disappears. Stanley's Cup has no empathy for its characters. Nelson the Cancer Kid is just a prop, not a person. Jacovasaurs has no empathy for the audience. It subjects you to annoyance without giving you anything in return. Mr. Garrison's Fancy New Vagina has no empathy for the communities it's satirizing. It reduces transgender identity to a punchline without acknowledging the humanity underneath. When the empathy is present, even the most offensive episodes feel humane. When it's absent, even the most technically proficient episodes feel cold. I've been working on this video for a long time now, and I keep discovering new things about why the bad episodes matter. Every time I think I've said everything there is to say, another connection surfaces. Another pattern reveals itself. And I think that's because the bad episodes aren't isolated failures. They're nodes in a web. Each one connects to the others through shared creative philosophies, shared production pressures, shared artistic ambitions that exceeded the show's grasp. Understanding one bad episode helps you understand all of them, and understanding all of them helps you understand the show. Let me talk about the show's specials and whether expanded runtimes are generally good or bad for South Park, because this connects to the Season 20 problem in ways that I think are illuminating. South Park's theatrical film, bigger, longer, and uncut, released June 30th, 1999, is widely considered one of the best animated films ever made. It was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Original Song for Blame Canada. It grossed $83 million worldwide against a $21 million budget. And it works brilliantly at 81 minutes because it uses the extended runtime to do things that the TV show can't. Elaborate musical numbers, sustained character arcs, a plot with genuine emotional stakes. The movie earns its length, but the Paramount Plus specials, with their 45 to 50-minute runtimes, sit in an awkward middle ground. They're too long for the punchy, relentless pacing of a regular episode and too short for the sustained world building of a movie. They're television specials trying to be movies, and they end up being neither. The best ones, Post-COVID and its sequel, work because they have a genuinely ambitious narrative concept that justifies the extended runtime. The weakest ones feel padded, stretched, like 22-minute ideas wearing 45-minute clothes. This is, I think, an important frontier for understanding South Park's creative limitations. The show's failures almost always involve too much time and not enough material. The successes almost always involve the perfect amount of material compressed into the tightest possible space. 22 minutes is South Park's sweet spot. It's the format the show was built for, and departing from it, whether by serializing across 10 episodes or stretching into specials, introduces new risks that the show doesn't always manage successfully. Now, let me address something that I've been avoiding because it's uncomfortable. Some of the episodes on Worst of Lists are there, not because they're poorly made, but because they've aged badly. And aged badly, in the context of South Park, is a complicated phrase, because the show has always been provocative. But there's a difference between provocation that remains relevant, and provocation that simply reveals the biases of its era. Some early episodes use slurs and stereotypes that were considered edgy in the late 90s, and now just feel mean. The show's treatment of certain communities in its first few seasons, before more nuanced portrayals evolved, can be cringeworthy. Certain episodes about disability, race, and gender identity from the early to mid-2000s feel like artifacts of a less thoughtful time. even by South Park's own later standards. The show has gotten smarter about these topics over the years, but the old episodes still exist, and they can be hard to sit with. I don't think this means the old episodes should be hidden or removed. South Park has always been a show that reflects the culture of its moment, and the culture of 1997 or 2003 or 2005 was different from today. The interesting thing is watching how the show evolves, how Parker and Stone's own thinking shifts, how the satire sharpens, how targets that were once treated as jokes start being treated as fully realized characters and communities. That evolution is, in many ways, the most interesting story South Park has to tell. And the bad episodes are the evidence of where the evolution started. I've heard people say that South Park hasn't aged well. I disagree. I think South Park has aged the way a person ages, unevenly, with wrinkles and scars and things you'd do differently if you could go back, but also with accumulated wisdom, with hard-earned nuance, with a depth of understanding that only comes from having been around long enough to see your own mistakes and learn from them. The bad episodes are the wrinkles. They're part of the face. I also want to briefly mention the Crab People ending, because it's maybe the most famous bad ending in South Park history, and it reveals something crucial about how Parker and Stone deal with creative dead ends. The Crab People first appeared as a Deus Ex Machina resolution in South Park is Gay, Season 7, Episode 8, October 22nd, 2003. The metrosexual trend sweeping through town turns out to be a plot by subterranean crab people to weaken human men. Parker and Stone have said this ending is their least favorite thing they've ever done. It was a panic solution when they'd written themselves into a corner, and fans kind of loved it. The Crab People became a fan favorite meme precisely because of how ridiculous they are. The ending is so aggressively nonsensical that it loops back around to being funny. And here's what I find fascinating. The Crab People ending became a kind of template. Not officially, not deliberately, but there's a whole category of South Park episodes where the resolution is deliberately anticlimactic or absurd, as if Parker and Stone are acknowledging that they don't have a clean way to end the story. Sometimes this works beautifully. The Underpants Gnome's business plan, with the literal question mark for step 2, is one of the most quoted jokes in the show's history. Sometimes it doesn't work at all. But the willingness to end an episode with, "We don't know how to end this, so here's something weird," is, in its own way, a kind of honesty about the creative process. There's another type of bad episode I want to explore, and it's the episode that starts strong and then loses its way halfway through. Because these are actually the most frustrating kind. The ones that you can feel slipping away from you in real time. Moss Piglets, Season 21, Episode 8, November 15th. 2017. The setup is wonderful. The special education class is having a science fair, and Nathan and Mimsy, the show's delightful tribute to classic Looney Tunes villain dynamics, are determined to win with a baking soda volcano so they can impress girls. Their competition, Jimmy and Timmy's genuinely fascinating study of tardigrades, those indestructible micro-animals that can survive in the vacuum of space. Nathan and Mimsy try to sabotage the tardigrades by poisoning and electrocuting them. But because tardigrades are basically indestructible, each sabotage attempt only makes them smarter. The water bears start dancing to Taylor Swift. They learn the hokey pokey. It's absurd. It's sweet. And the Nathan-Mimsy dynamic is firing on all cylinders. And then, about halfway through, the episode takes a hard turn. Government helicopters arrive. Men in suits descend on the school. And they're not there for scientific reasons. They're from the NFL, led by Dallas Cowboys owner Jerry Jones. And they want the tardigrades to fill empty stadium seats and counteract the league's declining attendance from national anthem protests. I can tell you the exact moment I felt the episode slip out of my hands, because it was the moment the camera pulled back from Nathan's face, from his scheming, plotting, wonderfully expressive face, and landed on Jerry Jones explaining his business model for microscopic sports fans. The AV Club's review called it out directly. The episode gets too far away from the characters at its center. Den of Geek gave it 2 out of 5 stars, saying that the promise of Nathan and Mimsy was derailed by Jones and the NFL. And here's the thing, the NFL satire isn't even bad exactly. The joke that the league's response to losing fans is to literally manufacture new ones at the microscopic level is a solid South Park idea, but it belongs in a different episode. An episode built around it from the ground up, with the boys or Randy or somebody as the protagonist. Grafting it onto a Nathan and Mimsy story is like performing open heart surgery on a patient who came in for a tooth cleaning. Both procedures are valid, but not at the same time, and not on the same patient. This is actually one of the show's most recurring failure modes, the collision of two unrelated plot lines that never merge into a satisfying whole. It happened in A Million Little Fibers, with the Towley Memoir and Oprah's Anatomy. It happened in Going Native, when the Hawaiian satire swallowed the Butters character study. And it happens periodically throughout the later seasons, when the pressure to be topical, to comment on whatever's happening in the news that week, overwhelms the character-driven story that the episode started telling. I think this problem got worse as the show's cultural position changed. In the early seasons, South Park was the upstart. It was the weird, crude, underground thing that the mainstream didn't understand. It could do whatever it wanted, because nobody was expecting anything from it. But by the late 2000s and into the 2010s, South Park had become an institution. People expected it to have a take on everything. If something major happened in the world, a presidential election, a mass shooting, a cultural controversy, there was an assumption that South Park would address it. And that expectation, however flattering, became a creative burden. Because sometimes the most interesting story isn't the topical one. Sometimes the most interesting story is Nathan trying to win a science fair. Let me talk about something that I've been circling around without directly addressing: the role of the audience in creating worst episodes. Because I don't think it's entirely up to the show which episodes are considered bad. The audience brings expectations, and when those expectations are violated, the response isn't always proportional to the actual quality of the episode. Take Terrence and Phillip in Not Without My Anus again. If that episode had aired as a mid-season filler, episode 7 of season 2, say, rather than episode 1, it probably would have been received as a weird, experimental outing. Some fans would have loved it, some would have skipped it, and nobody would have sent 2,000 angry emails to Comedy Central. What made it a worst episode wasn't the content, it was the context. It aired in the slot where fans expected the resolution of a cliffhanger. The betrayal of expectation is what created the backlash. Similarly, Stanley's Cup was a season finale. If it had been episode 3 of season 10, sandwiched between other episodes, its bleak ending would have landed differently. But as the final episode of the season, the note the show chose to go out on, it felt like a deliberate provocation. This is the last thing you get until next year, and it's children getting beaten up by professional hockey players. That choice of placement is what turned a strange, dark experiment into a widely hated finale. I think about this a lot because it means that worst isn't always about quality. Sometimes it's about timing, about placement, about the gap between what you wanted and what you got. And that gap isn't the show's problem. It's a collision between the show's intentions and the audience's desires. Parker and Stone have always been more interested in making the show they want to make than in making the show audiences expect. That's their greatest strength and their most persistent source of friction with fans. You know, I've also been thinking about how the show handles callbacks to its own worst moments. Because South Park has this fascinating self-awareness about its own failures, the crab people return in later episodes as a known quantity. The boys reference them. They show up in crowd scenes. Pip's death in 201 is almost a public execution of the show's most disliked element. The season 20 finale is literally titled The End of Serialization as We Know It. Parker and Stone naming the problem and killing it in the same breath. There's a meta level to South Park that most shows don't have. Parker and Stone are constantly processing their own creative journey through the show itself. When they're excited about the show, the episodes are energetic and ambitious. When they're burned out, you get episodes like You're Getting Old, where Stan literally sees everything as crap. When they regret a creative decision, they write an episode that corrects it. The show is, in a very real sense, a diary. And the bad entries in a diary are still entries. They still tell you something about the person writing them. I want to mention one more thing before I get to The Return of Chef. There's a specific type of episode that appears on worst of lists that I think is actually just polarizing rather than genuinely bad. These are episodes where the humor is so specific, so targeted at a particular audience or sensibility, that it creates a huge gap between people who love it and people who hate it. Royal Pudding, Season 15, Episode 3, which aired on May 11th, 2011, is a perfect example. It's about the Prince of Canada's wedding being disrupted by a kidnapping, with a B-plot about a kindergarten dental hygiene play that spirals into chaos. It's deeply, aggressively Canadian in its humor. The floppy-headed Canadians, the bizarre royal traditions, the mix of violence and politeness. Some fans find it hilarious. Others find it unwatchable. The IMDb score reflects this split. It sits in the low 7s, which for South Park means polarized. Not bad, not great, just divisive. And I think that's fine. I think a show that makes 300 plus episodes over nearly 30 years is going to have episodes that don't work for everyone. That's not a failure. That's a feature. It means the show is still taking risks, still trying new things, still refusing to stay in a comfort zone. If every episode appealed to everyone, the show would be bland. Some episodes are going to be your favorite that someone else can't stand, and vice versa. The worst of lists are partially just records of that disagreement. The episodes that are genuinely, universally bad, the ones that even Parker and Stone don't like, are actually very few. Pip, A Million Little Fibers, maybe Jacovosaurs. That's 3 episodes out of over 300, a failure rate of roughly 1%. For a show made at the pace South Park is made, that's not just impressive, it's miraculous. Okay, I want to talk about one more episode before we start winding down. The Return of Chef, Season 10, Episode 1, March 22nd, 2006. And I want to talk about it because it occupies this impossible space between being a terrible episode and being a necessary one. Background: Isaac Hayes, the legendary musician who voiced Chef, left the show after the Season 9 episode Trapped in the Closet aired on November 16, 2005. That episode ruthlessly mocked Scientology, a religion Hayes was a member of. Hayes' departure was messy. He issued a statement criticizing the show for being intolerant of religion, which prompted Stone to point out that Hayes had never complained when the show mocked Christianity, Judaism, Islam, or any other faith. In 2016, Hayes' son, Isaac Hayes III, revealed that his father had been pressured to quit by the Church of Scientology, and that, due to a stroke he'd suffered in January 2006, Hayes may not have even been fully aware of the statement released in his name. The Return of Chef brought Chef back using crudely spliced audio from previous episodes. The character sounds wrong, disjointed, choppy. His sentences obviously stitched together from unrelated recordings. And the show acknowledges this within the narrative. Chef has been brainwashed by the Super Adventure Club, a thinly veiled stand-in for Scientology, and his strange behavior is a symptom of the mind control. The episode ends with Chef falling off a bridge, being impaled, burned, mauled by animals, and shot. A death so excessive that it loops back around to being absurd. It's South Park's way of killing a character they loved, because the real-world circumstances made it impossible to keep him. Now, is this a good episode? Good? Honestly, no. The spliced audio is distracting. The plot is thin. The jokes about the Super Adventure Club's obsession with molesting children are one note. As a piece of entertainment, it doesn't work. But as a piece of history, it's essential. It's South Park processing a painful loss in real time, using the only tools it has: satire, excess, and brutal honesty. Parker and Stone loved Isaac Hayes. They'd worked with him for 9 years. They'd written some of the show's most beloved moments for his character. And when the Scientology conflict forced a separation, they didn't pretend it hadn't happened. They didn't quietly write Chef out between seasons. They confronted it head on in the most South Park way possible, by making it ugly, making it ridiculous, and making it real. I think about The Return of Chef whenever people accuse South Park of being heartless, because this is an episode that, beneath its offensive surface, is grieving. Parker and Stone are saying goodbye to a friend and a character they loved, and they're doing it the only way they know how, by making you laugh and cringe at the same time. It's not pretty, but it's honest. And that's the final lesson from the worst episodes, I think. South Park has never tried to be pretty. It has never tried to be elegant, or refined, or tasteful. It has tried, always, and relentlessly, to be honest. And sometimes, honesty is ugly. Sometimes it's uncomfortable. Sometimes it's a million little fibers. But the commitment to honesty, even when it produces bad television, is what separates South Park from every show that's ever tried to imitate it. The imitators copy the crudeness. They copy the offensive jokes. They copy the topicality. But they can't copy the honesty, because honesty means being willing to fail. And most shows aren't willing to fail. I've been going through all these episodes, the worst of the worst. And do you know what I keep coming back to? Every single one of them was made in 6 days or less. Every single one. The show's legendary production schedule means that even the failures are produced at a pace that would break most animation studios. Trey Parker is writing, directing, performing voices, and editing in a window that most shows use just for script writing. And the cost of that speed is that not everything can be polished. Not everything can be reconsidered. Sometimes you have an idea on Monday, animate it by Thursday, and realize on Saturday that it doesn't work. But by then, it's already aired. That production model, documented in the 2011 documentary 6 Days to Air, directed by Arthur Bradford, which premiered on October 9th, 2011, and was nominated for an Emmy in the Outstanding Nonfiction Special category, is both the show's greatest asset and the source of its worst episodes. The 6-day cycle is what allows South Park to respond to current events faster than any other scripted show on television. It's what made the Bin Laden references in FunnyBot possible just days after the event. It's what allowed them to air an episode about the 2008 election the night after Obama won. But it also means there's no safety net. There's no writer's room that's been working for months. There's no extensive notes process. There's Trey Parker, sleep-deprived and stressed, standing in front of a whiteboard, hoping that whatever he comes up with on Tuesday will still be funny on Wednesday. That's terrifying. It's also beautiful, and it's why even the worst South Park episodes feel alive in a way that most bad TV doesn't. They're not the product of a machine. They're the product of two guys in a room, exhausted, running on adrenaline and coffee, making decisions in the moment, and living with the consequences. Sometimes those decisions are genius. Make Love, Not Warcraft, which was literally conceived and executed in a single week. And sometimes those decisions are, let's have Oprah's vagina take a hostage. But they're always decisions made by human beings in the act of creating something, and there's a vitality to that process that no amount of polish can replicate. I want to dwell on this production reality for a bit longer, because I think people drastically underestimate how unusual South Park's creation process is. Think about most animated shows you watch. The Simpsons takes approximately 6 to 8 months per episode. Family Guy takes a similar timeline. Bob's Burgers, Archer, Rick and Morty, all of them operate on production schedules measured in months, not days. Writers craft scripts over weeks. Storyboard artists spend additional weeks visualizing those scripts. Animation teams in studios across the world spend months bringing the visuals to life. Revisions happen. Notes from networks get addressed. Voice actors record and re-record until the delivery is perfect. South Park does all of that. Writing, voice acting, storyboarding, animation, editing, sound mixing in 6 days, Monday through Saturday, and it airs on Wednesday, which means the actual creative work needs to be largely complete by Tuesday night. The animation is happening in real time alongside the writing. Voice actors are recording dialogue for scenes that haven't been fully animated yet. Sound designers are mixing audio, while the final animation renders are still processing. It's controlled chaos, and when it works, it produces television that feels immediate, urgent, alive, in a way that no other animated show can match. When it doesn't work, it produces episodes that feel rushed, unfocused, and incomplete. The documentary captures this perfectly. There's a sequence where Parker and the team are animating a scene on Thursday, and Parker decides the scene doesn't work. He wants to rewrite it. The animation team looks at him with the expression of people who know that rewriting a scene on Thursday of a 6-day production means they'll be working through the night, and they do it anyway, because that's the culture, that's the deal. You sacrifice comfort for freshness. You sacrifice polish for immediacy. You sacrifice the certainty of a well-tested script for the electricity of something just invented. When you understand this, really understand it, not as an abstract fact, but as a lived reality, the worst episodes stop being mysteries. They become inevitable. Of course, some episodes don't work. The miracle is that any of them work at all. The show is a high-wire act performed 5 to 10 times a year, and the wire is strung over a pit of deadline pressure and creative expectation that would destroy most artists. Parker doesn't just risk failure, he lives in its shadow. Every Monday morning, he walks into the writer's room knowing that in 6 days, whatever he creates will be broadcast to millions of people. There is no hiding. There is no delay. There is no, we'll fix it in post. Post is happening simultaneously with everything else. I sometimes wonder what South Park would look like if it had a normal production schedule. If Parker and Stone took 6 months per episode instead of 6 days. Would the bad episodes disappear? Probably. But I think the best episodes would disappear too, because the best episodes are inseparable from the urgency that creates them. The topicality, the rawness, the feeling of watching something that was made yesterday about something that happened today. All of that comes from the speed. Slow South Park down, and you'd get a more consistent show. You'd also get a less remarkable one. The price of greatness is the occasional catastrophe, and South Park has always been willing to pay that price. And here's what else strikes me. The people who work on South Park, not just Parker and Stone, but the entire animation team, the voice actors, the editors, the sound designers, they all operate at this pace. They all live inside this pressure cooker, and they've been doing it for decades. Many of the team members have been with the show for 15, 20 years. They've developed a shorthand, an efficiency, a creative telepathy that allows them to do in 6 days what other studios take 6 months to accomplish. The bad episodes aren't failures of the team. They're failures that happen despite the team's extraordinary competence. And that distinction matters, because it means the problem isn't laziness or incompetence, it's the fundamental unpredictability of creativity. You can have the best team in the world, the most experienced animators, the most talented voice actors, and if the idea at the center isn't strong enough, none of it saves the episode. Let me try to pull all of these threads together, because I've been weaving between episodes and themes and production details for a while now, and I want to make sure the tapestry is visible. Before I do that final synthesis, I want to mention a few more episodes that deserve brief attention. Spring Break, Season 26, Episode 6, which aired on March 29th, 2023, tried to parody Andrew Tate's brand of toxic masculinity and didn't quite land. The Tate parody felt toothless. There was a lot to say about that particular cultural moment. But the episode examined Randy's need to party more than it examined the ideology it was supposedly satirizing. The Garrison plotline about rage addiction leading to a recreation of the January 6th insurrection had potential, but it felt restrained, like the show was holding back. And South Park should never hold back. Moss Piglets, which I discussed earlier, represents another common failure type. The episode that's 2 good half episodes stitched into one mediocre whole. The Nathan and Mimsy Science Fair is one episode. The NFL Ratings Crisis is another episode. Together, they're neither. The AV Club reviewer nailed it when they noted that the episode abandoned its strongest characters, Jimmy, Timmy, Nathan, and Mimsy, in favor of a topical subplot that didn't need them. It's a structural error, not a creative one. The individual pieces are fine. The assembly is wrong. And then there's the broader category of episodes from seasons 23 and 24, the Tegrity Farms era, where Randy's marijuana business dominated the show to a degree that alienated fans who wanted to see more of the boys. Randy is a fantastic character. His journey from background dad to lead protagonist is one of the show's most interesting evolutions. But when every episode becomes a Randy episode, the show starts feeling lopsided. The boys, Stan, Kyle, Cartman, Kenny, are the show's center of gravity. When they're sidelined for too long, the show starts wobbling on its axis. The Tegrity Farms run illustrates a tension that's been present in South Park since the very beginning. The tension between Parker and Stone's creative interests, and the audience's expectations. Parker has talked openly about finding the boys' storylines less interesting as he's gotten older. He's more drawn to the adult characters, Randy, Gerald, PC Principal, because their problems are more relatable to a man in his 50s. But the audience watches South Park for the boys, for Cartman's schemes and Kyle's moral outrage, and Stan's quiet bewilderment, and Kenny's muffled heroism. When the show drifts too far from those characters, it drifts from its audience. And drift, more than any single bad episode, is what creates the impression of decline. But even during the Tegrity era, flashes of brilliance appeared. Banned in China, Season 23, Episode 2, October 2nd, 2019, was banned in China within hours of airing for its unflinching portrayal of Chinese government censorship and its influence on American entertainment companies. The episode showed Randy trying to sell weed in China, while the boys' death metal band discovers that every creative industry has to self-censor to access the Chinese market. It was sharp, brave, and immediately consequential in the real world. That's South Park at its most powerful. And it happened in the middle of a season that many fans consider mediocre. Which brings me back to the fundamental paradox of South Park's worst episodes. They coexist with brilliance. They don't replace it. They don't prevent it. They sit alongside it in the same seasons, sometimes in consecutive weeks. The worst and best of South Park are neighbors, not enemies. They share a street. They wave at each other in the morning. And understanding one helps you appreciate the other. Let me try to pull all of these threads together, because I've been weaving between episodes and themes and production details for a while now, and I want to make sure the tapestry is visible. Here's what I think the worst South Park episodes tell us, taken as a whole. And I want to be thorough here, because these are the conclusions I've been building toward for the entire video. First, South Park is built on balance. The balance between crude and clever, between offensive and insightful, between character comedy and cultural satire, between chaos and heart. When any one of these elements overwhelms the others, the episode fails. A Million Little Fibers is all crudeness, no cleverness. Funnybot is all concept, no character. Pip is all ambition, no anchor. Stanley's Cup is all darkness, no warmth. The great episodes keep every element in proportion. The bad ones let one element take over. Second, South Park needs its constraints. The 22-minute format, the 6-day production cycle, the core cast, the town setting. These aren't limitations. They're the structure that gives the show its shape. When the show removes those constraints, going to 45 minutes, serializing across a season, removing the main characters, setting the episode in London or Hawaii, it loses the framework that makes it work. The constraints are the container, and the creativity fills the container. Without the container, the creativity just spreads, thins out, loses definition. Third, South Park's failures are acts of courage. Every bad episode represents a creative risk that didn't pay off. Pip was a risk. Terrence and Phillip in Not Without My Anus was a risk. Season 20's serialization was a risk. The Paramount Plus specials were a risk. None of them worked perfectly. But the willingness to take those risks, to blow up the formula, to alienate the audience, to try something that might fail spectacularly, is what keeps the show vital after nearly 3 decades. A show that never risked failure would have been canceled by season 5 out of sheer boredom. South Park's failures are proof that it's still alive. Fourth, and finally, South Park's worst episodes are inseparable from its best. You don't get Trapped in the Closet without Mr. Garrison's Fancy New Vagina. You don't get the brilliant post-COVID specials without the wreckage of season 20. You don't get the Man-Bear-Pig correction without the Man-Bear-Pig mistake. The show learns. It evolves. It circles back. And the bad episodes are the compost from which the good episodes grow. Remove them, and the soil is too thin. The garden doesn't flourish. I started this video by saying that I think the worst South Park episodes are secretly teaching you something important about why the show works. And I still believe that. But I want to add something. They're not just teaching you about the show. They're teaching you about creativity itself, about how messy it is, how unpredictable, how dependent on time and pressure and circumstance, about how the same process that produces genius can produce garbage, and how you can't have one without accepting the other, about how failure isn't the opposite of success. It's the raw material for it. Every creative person I've ever talked to about their work says some version of the same thing. The bad stuff has to come out before the good stuff can. You have to write the terrible first draft to get to the brilliant final draft. You have to paint over the canvas 3 times before the image reveals itself. You have to sit with the bad idea long enough to understand why it's bad, and that understanding is what guides you toward the good idea. South Park does this in public, in real time, on national television. And the bad episodes are the evidence. So here's where I land. And I know this might be controversial, but I've been thinking about it for a long time. The worst episodes of South Park are not only forgivable, they're essential. Not because they're secretly good. Some of them are legitimately, irredeemably bad, but because they represent the cost of doing business the way Parker and Stone do business. You don't get Scott Tenorman Must Die without Jacovosaurs. You don't get Trapped in the Closet without Mr. Garrison's Fancy New Vagina. You don't get the brilliant Paramount Plus specials without the wreckage of season 20. The failures are the price of the successes. And I'd rather have a show that swings wildly between 6.1 and 9.8 on IMDb than one that safely cruises at a 7.5 for its entire run. Parker himself has said that he'd like to see the first 3 seasons disappear altogether, that he cringes at the early episodes and thinks the show didn't really find itself until later. Stone disagrees. He looks back at the early days with nostalgia and fondness, and I think they're both right. The early episodes are rough. Some of them are bad, but they're also where the show figured out what it was. You can't have the destination without the journey, and the journey includes every wrong turn. I think about South Park's nearly 30-year run. The show premiered on August 13th, 1997, which means it's been on the air for almost 3 decades. And I'm amazed not by the great episodes, of which there are hundreds, but by the fact that the show has survived its bad ones. Most shows would have been canceled after a season like season 20. Most shows would have lost their audience after A Million Little Fibers. Most shows wouldn't have dared to pull the Terrence and Phillip prank at the height of their popularity. But South Park isn't most shows. South Park is 2 guys from Colorado who met at the University of Colorado Boulder in 1992, who made a short film out of construction paper cutouts, who got a show on Comedy Central that nobody expected to last a full season, and who are now, nearly 3 decades in, with a $900 million Paramount deal signed in 2021 and no signs of stopping. The bad episodes didn't stop them. The bad episodes are part of the story. And tonight, sitting with these failures, turning them over, finding the lessons hidden inside them, I think I understand the show better than I did before. Not because I've learned what South Park does well, I already knew that, but because I've learned what happens when it doesn't. And what happens is, it comes back. It always comes back. There's a particular way that South Park comes back that I want to highlight, because it's different from how other long-running shows recover from bad patches. Most shows recover by returning to what worked before. They go back to the formula. They play the hits. They give the audience what it wants. South Park doesn't do that. When South Park recovers from a bad streak, it recovers by trying something new. It moves forward, not backward. After the serialization disaster of season 20, they didn't go back to pure standalone episodes from the golden age. They found a new hybrid format, episodes with loose thematic connections, but individual plots that worked on their own terms. After the worst of the early seasons, they didn't retreat to safe ground. They pushed harder into political satire, character development, and formal experimentation. After the Tegrity Farms fatigue, they started giving the boys more prominent roles again, while maintaining Randy's expanded importance. The recovery is always forward, never backward, and that forward momentum is itself a kind of creative philosophy. The belief that the answer to a bad idea is a new idea, not an old one. After the serialization disaster of season 20, they didn't go back to pure standalone episodes. They found a new hybrid format, episodes with loose thematic connections but individual plots. After the worst of the early seasons, they didn't retreat to safe ground. They pushed harder into political satire, character development, and formal experimentation. The recovery is always forward, never backward. And that forward momentum is why the bad episodes ultimately don't matter in the long run. Not because they're forgiven or forgotten, but because they're left behind. The show doesn't dwell on its failures. It doesn't make apology episodes or issue press releases explaining what went wrong. It doesn't spend a season trying to repair the damage of the previous one. It just keeps making new episodes, week after week, season after season, year after year, and trusts that the law of averages and the relentlessness of its own creative engine will produce enough brilliance to balance out the occasional mess. And it does. It always does. That trust in the process, in the speed, in the creative partnership between 2 guys who've been making each other laugh since college is maybe the most remarkable thing about South Park. Not the episodes, not the satire, not the controversies, the trust. Remember Pip, the episode everyone hates? The one without any of the main boys? The one Trey Parker said even he hates? I started this video with that episode, and I want to end with it, because Pip aired on November 29th, 2000. And the very next week, December 6th, 2000, South Park aired Fat Camp, Season 4, Episode 15. An episode where Cartman gets sent to a weight loss camp, and Kenny eats increasingly disgusting things on a live TV show, and the whole thing ends with Chef explaining to the boys what a prostitute is. It's funny, it's weird, it's perfectly, unmistakably South Park. 1 week, that's how long it took. 1 week between the show's worst episode and a perfectly solid one. That's the thing about South Park. It's never more than 7 days from a comeback. And honestly, I think that's the most important thing the bad episodes teach us. Not about structure or character or production or satire, though they teach us all of those things, but about resilience, about the creative act of getting up after you fall, about putting something out into the world that you know might not work, watching it fail, and then coming back to your desk on Monday morning and starting again from nothing. That's what Trey Parker does, every week, for almost 30 years. He faces the blank page, knowing that whatever he produces will be seen by millions of people, and knowing that some of it will be bad, and he writes anyway. And some of it is bad, and a lot of it, a staggering, improbable, nearly miraculous amount of it, is great. The worst episodes of South Park are the price of that courage, and I'm glad they exist. Not because I enjoy watching them. I don't particularly, though some of them have grown on me with time and analysis. But because they're proof that the show is still human, still vulnerable, still made by people who don't know if Monday's idea will be Wednesday's triumph or Wednesday's disaster. And that uncertainty, that fundamental, irreducible uncertainty, is what makes South Park the most alive show on television. Thank you for watching this. Thank you for sitting with the bad episodes, the ugly episodes, the episodes that test your patience and challenge your love for this show. Thank you for being the kind of person who wants to understand not just what something is, but how it works and what happens when it breaks. That's what we do here. That's what Paper Town is about. Go ahead and hit subscribe if you haven't. Leave a comment telling me which episode you think is the worst, because I guarantee you I missed your pick, and I want to hear about it. Share this with someone who loves South Park and thinks they've seen everything. I promise this video will show them something they haven't considered before. Good night, everyone. Sleep well.